Great, so maybe we'll start now. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining tonight's talk, Women in Water, Mythologies, Earthly Species, Hydrofeminism and Future Perspectives with Federico Rudari. It's brilliant to see so many of you here. I'm Naomi Polonsky, Associate Curator at the Women's Art Collection and Curator of the exhibition Women in Water. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, the Women's Art Collection is a collection of modern and contemporary art by women based at Murray Edwards College, which is one of the 2 colleges for women at the University of Cambridge. The works of art are hung all around the college, and there are sculptures permanently sited in the gardens. The building where Murray Edwards is situated was designed by the modernist architect Chamberlain Powell and Bonn in the early 1960s. And at the heart of the structure is a sunken fountain court, which connects the different parts of the college and creates a distinctive atmosphere throughout. The exhibition Women in Water was inspired by this architectural feature and aims to probe the long-standing relationship between women in water in art, as well as architecture, literature, and ecology. It brings together the work of 17 artists spanning from the early 20th century to the present day, and they're in a range of mediums, including painting, printmaking, and video. Federico will focus on some of these works during his talk, as well as taking us on a fluid journey that touches on everything from mythical sea monsters to bottled water. Federico is a doctoral researcher in cultural studies at the Lisbon Consortium in Portugal. His research focuses on the phenomenological understanding of contemporary cultural production and how it is perceived by individuals and collective audiences. His work questions the mediation and pedagogical purposes in exhibition spaces. Please post your questions and comments in the Q&A box at any point during the talk. Thank you so much for spending your Thursday evening with us, and we really hope that you enjoy the talk. So now, Federico, I will make you host so that you can start sharing your screen.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining the talk. I'd also like to thank Naomi for the invitation and the introduction. Before starting, I'd like to give you a brief presentation of the structure of the talk, which is designed around 4 sections that complement each other. The first one discusses the trajectory of water in modern Western capitalist culture and the way it is perceived and represented in dominant narratives. The second section addresses how women, the feminine, and water have been associated throughout history in art, mythologies, and systems of oppression. Later, alternatives to this model are presented, bringing water and watery multi-species relationality to the center of environmental justice. Last, we'll conclude by looking at some of the exhibited works and discussing the way dominant visions are here challenged by women artists and their practices. I want to begin by reading this quote from Astrid Neyman's book, Bodies of Water, Post-Human Feminist Phenomenology, which I think perfectly summarizes the intention and direction of the talk. As glaciers melt, deltas flood, and we roll out life force down the middle of the river Anthropocene, it seems we need an invaluable tool we can master to negotiate the rising tide, pushing it from the sea. Bodies of water as lived embodiment, as figuration, as hydro-commons indifference, and as feminist protest may not be the paddle that will guide us out of this planetary mess, but I'm wagering that this figuration might just help us learn to swim. It seems that today, water is everywhere in stories of hydrological, climatic, and humanitarian crises and disasters, metaphorically and representationally. Think, for instance, about the way philosopher and sociologist Zygmunt Bauman depicted late modernity as liquid and how it dominated discourse in the past decades. Source of life and death, salvation and disease, a political and psychological instrument, a natural and cultural object, mountain spring and bottled water. Water dominates contemporary realities and narratives. In his influential work, H2O and the Waters of Forgetfulness, Ivan Illich argues that water has experienced a progressive scientific abstraction in opposition to the integral role it played for pre-modern communities. While there was a variety of waters according to use and an environmental function, water is today extracted from our social life and experience. Perceived as an invariant entity, a scientific combination of hydrogen and oxygen, water is today mainly understood and addressed as a resource. In this context, Jamie Linton manifests a dissatisfaction with the conceptualizations and abstractions that water has experienced in the industrialized world through the 20th century, calling for a need for critical perspectives on the way we see and understand water and what it defines the institutional, social, and political dimension of the water-society nexus. Linton argues that phenomena cannot be effectively described by the properties in themselves, especially because they are often culturally biased and therefore inconsistent. Instead, they should be defined by their interconnectedness with other phenomena. Water is thus described by the ways it relates to other elements, participates in processes, is thought of and employed, its potential forms, and much more. Water appears to have the potentiality of all shapes and unlimited practical and metaphorical potential. As Linton continues, and I quote, "We mix language, gods, bodies, and thought with water to produce the world and the selves we inhabit." From Egypt to Greece and Babylonia, in ancient cosmologies, water was associated with fecundity, and people conceived water as the fundamental substance out of which everything came into being. In Roman baths, water was considered a public element, a shared experience, and a way to cement civic bonds more than a tool for cleanliness or sanitation. Water is par excellence the element for initiation in many religions and culture, as well as destruction, as in the biblical flood. However, for most of the 20th century, we took water for granted. Greater concerns around the global water crisis, scarcity, pollution, and uneven geographic and social distribution of access to clean water and services are arising today, including the potentially dangerous hydrological consequences of climate change, such as the sea level rising. Thus, Linton differentiates three complementary dimensions of contemporary water: the ecological, namely its presence in an ecosystem; the cultural, its articulated meanings and relationships; and the political, the way it is tied to both economic benefits and affordances. While they've always been present, these dimensions today are presented to us in ways that challenge our modern abstract understanding of water and its nature. Among waters, modern water has been a particularly successful conceptualization because of its uncomplicated ecological, cultural, and social depiction. This approach not only made water an easy element to manage, but all waters in approximately any circumstance can be reduced to this abstraction, H2O. According to geographer Maria Kaika, modernity was a time of a new forward-looking worldview and a new set of social expectations, where human emancipation would pass through domination over nature, following the Cartesian assumption that the human mind is separate from nature, and therefore it sees nature as an object available for use. In this frame, the ultimate symbol of the hegemony of modern water is its conception as a source of energy. Water is maximally useful by producing hydroelectricity, but it requires to be fixed and managed first. As Linton writes, and I quote, "The intellectual abstraction of water as a natural quantity has been of primary importance to modern economic development, urbanization, agriculture, transportation, public health, and flood control, to name just a few modern necessities that have been made possible by development in hydrological science. The question of whether water science might even provide the basis of civilization has been raised by scholars. Here, civilization is understood following the primacy of scientific discourse, where, and I quote again, water is made known as an abstract, isomorphic, measurable quantity that may be reduced to its fundamental unit, a molecule of H2O, and represented as the substance that flows in the hydrologic cycle. Therefore, look at from a functional perspective, water is nothing more than two atoms of hydrogen and one of oxygen, constantly changing state and location. Modern water makes all water a homogeneous chemical compound, an essential substance, always out of time and space. Water is perceived separately from its environment and from people too. Control as a term in that placelessness of water, it is dematerialized and not particular to any place or group. It is just a metaphorical abstraction. Today, modern water has entered a critical phase. Its myth has become unsustainable, and the current state of crisis is forcing us to rethink about and re-get involved with water in new or odd ways to which perhaps we are little accustomed. Water is conceptually a social and cultural product, and thus it can change following pivotal social and cultural changes. The hydrologic cycle, as we know it, constructed a new view of water. It did not reveal its undiscussed nature, and the chemical compound uniform different per modern waters as a single utilitarian one. The association of the feminine element and water has existed since prehistoric time. On female deities depended the survival of coastal communities, the productivity of the aquatic ecosystem, omens, navigation, and much more. In the Mediterranean area, female marine symbolism was associated with both successes and losses related to the sea. These mythological figures were multiple and diverse, from elemental forces of water and nymphs to goddesses, sea creatures and epic heroines with a particular, often suffering, connection to water and the sea. Looking at Greek mythology, for instance, the connection between female entities and water, and the Mediterranean Sea in particular, are several. In Homer's Odyssey, water is deeply connected to the female element in numerous ways. First, sea-related danger assumed female form. Along with the well-known sirens drawing the sailors with their dangerous singing, while passing through the Strait of Messina, Ulysses must choose between facing two monsters, Scylla and Charybdis, both female in their description. Moreover, all the main female characters are either related to or associated with water in their presentation, or their destinies are linked to such elements. Daughter of King Alcinous, Nausicaa, whose name means burner of ships, is presented in Book 6, bathing and washing clothes with her handmaidens. A meeting with the castaway Odysseus will be a key narrative expedient for him to recount his adventures, forming a substantial section of the entire book. Enchantress, goddess, and key character, Circe might have gained her power from her mother, the Oceanid nymph Perse. Even Penelope's destiny heavily depends on the sea's mercy. The multi-layered symbolism around water and the female resonates throughout history and mythologies. Both an enclosed and life-generating force, think for instance of the womb and its symbolism, and an agitated, troubling, and illusionary one, a cleansing and a purifying element. Water has often been associated with the image of the woman and the female body in particular. For purity, or its desire, the materiality and symbolism of water are expanded to the woman's body. Eleanor Ruth Hyman writes that modern water is conceived within a gendered, hegemonical, and historical narrative, a whole Western epistemology. Water is a commodity that needs to be dominated, regulated, and managed, an overall neutral and passive resource. In this regard, she claims, and I quote, water's gendered materiality comes into question when viewed in light of environmental systems, toxic substances, and biological bodies. It is this critical interlacing of ideas about gender, purity, and power that makes water intensely political. Myths on water try to knot together nature and culture. The conception of water as a crystal clear, pure, and unlimited element does not work anymore today. Water is scarce. It needs technical and political management and chemical purification, water finds itself at the center of several apparently unresolvable dichotomies: nature versus culture, wilderness versus civilization, and man versus woman. However, as much as the female body, dominant power structure perceive and portray water passively. Its management and control, again, result in a sense of placelessness. Water is in the tap, an invisible engineering infrastructure in an undefined somewhere out there until it is present at our disposal. The ontology of mother water plays within the perpetuation of definite system of oppression. For instance, in the 19th century, together with the progressive expansion of hydraulic infrastructures, Impressionist and expressionist artists perpetuated the Western idea of the feminine linked to water and purity. The image of the bather expresses a hygienic take on the female nude, advertising a new intimacy of sanitation in the domestic sphere. Pure or impure, goddess or whore, the relationship or its lack of women and water is a key factor shaping the modern male gaze. The idea of control over nature, women, and water finds its apex in the contemporary bottled water, both in its conception, a fully controlled vision of water, pure and natural, yet dominated and for this reason desirable, and its representation, often in bottled water advertising, young women in white clothes and with natural makeup on drink from plastic bottles in snow-white mountainous landscapes. For these and many more reasons, challenging narratives on women and water means challenging gender-power relations. Political discourse, Hyman continues, labeled water as neutral. Through abstract placement, narratives and policies on medicine, and even more of sanitation, intentionally omitting how water immediately evokes issues of race and class. In their fundamental work, Environmental Orientalism, Susanna Sawyer and Arun Agrawal argues that the colonial attempt to control both geographies and bodies has deeply relied on practices of sexualization and racialization. Native topographies and people were labeled as feminine space of violation, where colonizing meant structuring as sexual as racial hierarchy. The masculine agency of European penetration was adapted to the female body, both physically and metaphorically. Also, in this context, the feminine is not homogeneous, and the racial elements played a key role in possession. As they write, the fathers of conservation biology affirmed their classificatory mission through feminizing and sexualizing tropes. Today, while conquering seems to be progressively more and more out of fashion, imitating colonial predecessors, Western biodiversity experts have appropriated nature as global and made themselves responsible for protecting it. Scientists and experts, almost only Western, made nature a mankind patrimony. Conquest is over, management is the new fetish. While the early colonial imagination marked native topographies as feminine, unexplored territories, today, once again, the most advertised solution, the overpopulation thesis, passes through the control over women's body, the reproductive system, and the global south. Today, and I quote, nature is still feminine, but differently raised. Rather than being savage or untamed, she is vulnerable and fragile. It requires protection, not conquest and subjugation. Our concern with gender is intimately linked with our concern with race. Gender ideologies, we believe, are marbled by racial, sexual, and class ordering. All species on Earth are living disturbing, mixed up, troubling, turbid times. As Donna Haraway writes in a book, Staying with the Trouble, Making Kin in the Toulousine, and I quote, the task is to make kin in lines of inventive connection as a practice of learning to live and die well with each other in thick present. In fact, staying with the trouble requires learning to be truly present, not as a vanishing pivot between awful redenic past and apocalyptic or salvific future, but as mortal creatures entwined in myriad and finished configuration of places, times, matters, meaning. Haraway argues that both Anthropo and Capitalocene did not provide the necessary conditions to move from destructive patterns and learn to stay with the trouble. It is the Cthulhu instead, the ongoing time place of the now, that we can learn to stay with the trouble, to live and die in responsibility on a damaged planet. To survive, we need to imagine new odd forms of kinship and unexpected ways of collaborating in a symbiotic making with. It is in, with, and through water, as Reader Neymanis claims, that such kinship is today possible. We are bodies of water, made out of wet matter, defined by discursive fluctuation of ideas, embodiment, and belief. Water supports the survival of individual organisms, but also facilitates interconnection with other bodies and non-human worlds, creating what Newman calls modern human hydrocarbons. As she argues, we depend on, and I quote, what this water does, where it comes from, where it goes, and what it is, and what it means along the way. Our wet matters are in constant process of intake, transformation, and exchange. Discrete individualism is a rather dry, if convenient, myth. Our water bodies' challenge to individualism is thus also a challenge to phallogocentrism, the masculinist logic of sharp-edged self-sufficiency. We are literally implicated in other animal, vegetable, and planetary bodies that materially course through us, replenish us, and draw upon our bodies and their wealth. The attempt to reimagine and redefine water and our relationship with it requires a feminist and posthuman understanding of agential realism and queer transcorporeality. When waters and water systems around the planet are wounded in multiple ways, our identification as bodies of water means including ourselves in the crisis and acting for an immediate response. However, this response must resist human exceptionalism and adopt a feminist approach to environmental justice, one that does not believe that there is any separation between natural and cultural in human bodiedness. Understanding our relationality, as borrowing the words of phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty, splatter of the word, means paying attention to differences and commonalities. The crisis comes from a social, modern imagery of water and the presumption of its limitless nature. There is no romantic vision of repair or equal justice. We are all bodies of water and all in trouble together, even though we are not all in trouble in the same way. For the definition and conceptualization of natural objects, we need both human and non-human tools. And when looked at only through science, nature is not forced, but made. As a cultural construct, scientific water makes sense within a specific context of signification. As French deconstructivist philosopher Jacques Derrida writes, classification as a seductive power, the one of the violence of drawing lines and making order on bodies and landscapes. To name is to own. In different works included in the Woman and Water exhibition created by Naomi, we witness less rigid and more malleable and fluid approaches to water, its understanding, and the relationality that this element implies. The idea of commonality evoked by Astrid Neymanis' conceptualization of water is reflected in Eileen Cooper's works on and artistic process. Seasick, 1989, evokes the emotional turmoil of the liquid journey through life. The work was revisited by the artist in time and went through different stages. Originally, the male figure was portrayed holding the red woman, but his body was in a later time. Floating in a frameless sea sky, the two female subjects represent two versions of the same woman going different directions, namely the simultaneous experience of being a young mother and an artist. Water is here not only the primordial element of life and survival, but also the means by which experience is possible, malleable, and decipherable. In Phoebe Boswell, The Salt Water Within Us, The Depths of Our Grief, The Leagues of Our Love, 2023, based on a still from her 2022 video installation Dwelling, in which swimmers and non-swimmers are paired and filmed in a small pool, water stands as a setting in the representation of its material and symbolic role in Black diaspora. As Kevin Dawson writes in Undercurrents of Power, Aquatic Culture in the African Diaspora, the ambitious culturescapes involved in the Black diaspora are contested terrains. Water is not only a central tool in the formation of identity, community, and power, but the practice of Black communities around water were weaponized by Europeans to enable the extraction of slaves. The reimagination of the spiritual bond with water facilitated the expression of distinctive visions of feminine and masculine embodiment and an alternative access of power for enslaved people. Both trauma and healing are processed through and with water. As Phoebe Boswell says, we morph and we float and we heal and we swim. Water records in numerous works as an element of cohesion between subjects, humans, nature, and other creatures, and even between different spheres of the self. The harbor and its waters and surroundings are the setting of the multi-species encounter depicted by Joyce Carn in Channel Night 2017. Both the sailor, the artist, and the seagull meet around the dinner table in the multi-perspective scenario that evokes both unrest and the stormy sea. However, the artist does not represent herself in a unitary way. She is the little girl stealing a jam tart on the left corner, the woman painting the scene from an attic, a naked figure emerging from a cottage on the right, and the young woman in the foreground. The past and the present cohabit in a fluid, malleable reality where water gives room for everyone to exist. Similarly, water represents a possibility for unity in Marcel Ancelar's North Sea Bathers, 1992. Work painted in the aftermath of her mother's death, Ancelar portrays the central figure as a combination of herself and her mother, while the artist as a child is charming in the lower left corner. Water is a frame for grief, disquiet, and fear, but also for meeting and remembering. As Ancelar claimed after creating another series set in the North Sea after the death of her sister, these paintings evolved in a sequence of scenes of ritual through which I tried to give form to events too complex to describe or to digest as a whole. Last, water is central in the exhibition in practice of activism and claim. Untitled Blue, 2009, is part of Sarah Lederman's series Siren, which includes various female figures in watery environments. Based on the artist's naked young body, the figure, no longer adolescent, not yet adult, blends with the colors of the background. Water is the element of multiple possibilities in definition and representation. In water, her subjects can be uncontainable, fluid, sexual, free, and difficult to grasp. Betsy Damon's Blue Hole, 2007, advocates the importance of water for all creatures and ecosystems as a human right, earth right, and life right. The mixed media work depicts a natural spring in Texas called Yanaguana, meaning spirit water, a sacred site for Native Americans long before the European occupation. Today, industrial water pumping nearby has caused the spring to go dry for most of the year. The activist and artistic work of Damon is committed to raising awareness about the importance of water living system preservation, leading to the Foundation of Keepers of the Water, a community-based activist group which deals with the preservation of living water systems. To conclude, today we looked at water as an element of major importance for multi-species existence and its relational dynamics with natural surroundings, but also as its multiple roles in terms of biology, philosophy, politics, and art history in many civilizations. However, it seems today that water is also at the center of multiple crises, humanitarian and climatic above all. Thus, it is imperative to find a more collaborative approach to water and the other. Change must be all-encompassing, a relational way of thinking with water in climate and political action, artistic practice, and modern human linguistic collaboration. We are required to be more careful in our daily practices and encounters with and through water, while being aware of the beauty, wealth, and complexity of these relations. If we want to be responsible to water, its articulation of kinship and radical importance in the places we inhabit, then we need to recognize, protect, and reiterate all the diversity that water implies. Thank you so much for your interest and attention. And if you have any questions or comments, I would be very happy to hear them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Federico, for that rich and wide-ranging presentation. It covered so much ground and looked at the topic of water from so many different angles and perspectives. First of all, I will ask a few questions, but also please do everyone feel free to post your own comments and questions. First of all, I wanted to ask about some of the words and concepts that you reference in the talk. So as an example, Astrida Nimanis often uses the term hydrocommons, and Donna Haraway talks about sympoiesis. Can you just explain a bit more what these words refer to in this context and perhaps even more broadly?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So the term sympoiesis that Donna Haraway uses is actually another translation for a concept of making with. So it comes from the combination of two Greek words, which mean make and together, and implies a relationality that must be present in action, in a vision of thing with the trouble. Well, hydrocommons, a concept which Nimanis uses a lot, I think it's a very interesting concept because it's a planetary framework in a sense that rejects the idea that water is organized in one system, which is the hydrologic cycle, as we know it we studied in science, but is a framework where we can rethink the world, but also environmental justice, all the aqueous connections that take place in the world. And she also calls it an hydrologic, so a methodology that we can imply to understand all the difference and even a knowability that can be found in water and water relations.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I thought was really interesting is how so many of the words associated with hydrofeminism derive from ancient Greek. So words like Anthropocene or Thulocene, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. So it's got the confusing CHTH at the beginning. But also the term hydro itself. You also spoke about ancient Greek mythology, the sirens, Scylla and Charybdis. What do you think is the effect at looking back at the ancient past in this way and bringing forward words and also symbols and images from that time? What bearing does it have on the present?
Well, I think first of all, looking back at the etymology of words, it's very important because it allows us to look behind concepts that may appear complex and convoluted, and make things simpler and understand ideas in the most basic unities, and which I think is essential then to reuse them and being able to not just learn theory, but be able to apply and to reuse these concepts in our practices. And so that I think that looking at the etymology of what is often the best way to understand concepts and what scholars and authors are saying. While on the other way, about mythology, I think that what is very interesting in mythologies in general, and I mean, I used Greek mythology as an example because it's the one with which I'm more familiar, is that there is a deep interconnectedness with nature elements in its own structuring. So even if reality might seem simpler or more universal, in a way, the way events evolve, the way action is planned, always depends on both human and nature in the same way. And I think that this connection is so strong that ancient Greeks attributed to nature anthropomorphic figures, so that they believed that agency in nature was as strong as the one of another human subject. And I think that also this concept about or this idea that looking at nature in link to divinity, gods, or deities, is also something that was very present, for example, in romantic view and Christianity. So there's an age that sees in nature something to respect, but also to fear. While let's say that also, I think, on Western religion today are going through or have been going through modernization or an enlightened version of this religion, which is more about the morality, about the individual on its own, or the relationship between individuals, and this interconnectedness with nature has been a bit lost on the way.
It's so interesting because you were speaking about how water is perceived as neutral and how increasingly it's seen as an element that is abstract outside of time and place. But at the same time, in parallel, there is this very long-standing association with women and femininity and also particular racial categories. So there's sort of this slightly contradictory thing happening. I was reading about water in the Victorian imagination, and apparently at the same time as there were all of these portrayals of drowned women, sometimes taking the form of Greek mythological figures, or contemporary drowned women often. There was also the construction of the Thames embankment. And in both cases, there was this idea of women needing to be constrained, particularly in their sexuality. But in terms of that kind of abstraction of the way water is perceived, what solutions do theorists propose to this harmful way of viewing water as, like you said, a resource, and what cultural or social changes do need to be made in human beings' relationship with water?
I think, I mean, it's a very complicated question, but I think that this idea that culture has been progressively been designed as human and separated from nature is exactly the point where we found ourselves today, and that reparation is not possible if we keep on developing within this extractivist paradigm in which we see ourselves as agent able to extract resources from nature and not as part of nature. And I think that, again, if we think that progress is only human, then there is no progress at all, because in the end, we're not isolated in this framework. So I think that relating to your question, I think that what is very central, is important, is that we start being more conscious and aware that our culture and social sphere cannot be separated from water or the nature elements in general, but also that everything that we might perceive as neutral is rarely neutral. And even the neutral thing per se is always political or often dominant also.
I thought there was a sort of nice irony to the fact that during the talk, periodically you would take some water and drink it. It just sort of proves how fundamental water is to our existence on an absolutely sort of everyday, constant basis. And we are extremely water-based creatures, with 90% composed of them. I was reading something that was saying that we're essentially jellyfish, although we don't like to sort of necessarily think of ourselves in that way. But I wanted to talk a bit more about the final section where you spoke about artworks in the exhibition, and drew out some of the ways in which they relate to the theoretical views and approaches to water, and how many of those works present a way of rethinking water, as you said. Is there, do you think, a way that hydrofeminist thinking can also influence the practice of exhibition making in relation to temporary exhibitions, for example, which by their very nature are fleeting? Is there a way that there could be a form of slow curating which would take place over a longer time span, and perhaps allow for an ongoing reassessment of thorny and contradictory issues. So that concept from Donna Haraway of a form of staying with trouble, but within the structure of an exhibition. I think you might be muted.
Okay, right. Thank you. Yeah, I think that it is very important to think that we have responsibility in curatorial practices, as you said, and often we are in a loop of like a temporary event and exhibition, and I think that also even unintentionally, sometimes or maybe often in the art world, there's a lot of colonial and heteropatriarchal epistemologies that are very much present in our practices. And I think that what you said about this contradiction, what is very important would be to bring this contradiction on the table. And probably the way we should go is being more open about this contradiction, express difficulties, express concerns, acknowledging that there are also these tensions in our practices, and maybe bringing this interconnectedness that Neyman talks about in our work, so opening more to more like a dialogical way of practicing rather than a top-down pedagogical way of lecturing. I think that a solution should be a process. We don't have it yet, unfortunately. So that bringing these tensions and contradictions within the space of an exhibition, I think, is the best way to exchange and learn how to stay in this trouble.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, there is something quite hydrofeminist about exhibitions in and of themselves, in that there are all of these objects made by different makers with all sorts of different perspectives on the world in one space together, in a way that is a conversation of sorts. And also perhaps to contextualize the water in the context of this exhibition that is presented, because to counter that kind of abstraction or neutrality of water that is very dominant in our cultural imagination, those artworks are very specific to particular places. So in Joyce Kern's work, she depicts a very specific part of the Scottish coast where she lived in Foot D. Or Betsy Damon's work presents this particular natural spring. And the fact that they converge in this one space, I think, is compelling in terms of the theory. Yeah, so we haven't had any questions so far, to which I'll say that you must all stop being shy and fire away to Federico, who's such an expert on this topic. But in the meantime, I just wanted to go back to one of the other things that you were talking about, which is representations of bathers, because that is a very common theme in a particular moment in Western art history. You showed an image of a Degas painting, but also there are other artists like Cézanne who are very well known for their paintings of bathers, and an essay by Linda Lachlan looking at that presentation. One of the interpretations of these works, particularly Cézanne's paintings of bathers, is that in a way they're presented almost like a still life, that the humanity is taken away from those female figures. But in relation to the theories of certain academics like Haraway and Neymanis, they might argue that that is how we should be thinking about species, in a much less hierarchical way. So there might not be so much difference between human and non-human beings. So can you maybe say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think that this is a very interesting point, and when I wanted to include this idea of the bathware also as a kind of precursor of the bottled water drinker, and I was looking at different paintings that I had in my mind, and I was thinking about also how to me what was central in selecting that specific example was exactly the idea of taking out that idea of purity or regeneration linked with water that was taken out of the natural context and brought inside, or where this multi-species element that you mentioned cannot exist. So the trajectory of the bathers, I think that is interesting because all these, also the Nausicaa, when Odysseus met her, she's bathing in the sea, but also this is an action that is in common with humans as any other animals. But in this sense, with this progressive, let's say, privatization of water, all the infrastructure that linked with the from the 19th to the 21st century, then even the purity or the idea of like the source of water are taken out of the natural context, and they are just functional for this new sanitation fetish that started. And I think this is very interesting, especially because all these elements that were present in nature are made private, are made domestic, are controlled. So also this idea of bathing, so we decide when it starts, when it's over, the temperature. So there's all these elements that we brought in are taken out, all the nature aspects and all these multi-species aspects that were present in the concept and the image of bathing, and are making bathing, human bathing, different from any other forms of bathing or any form of interaction with water. And I think that this is the difference exactly from the example that you mentioned, where there is a more horizontal and multi-species dimension of these.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And we now do have a question which relates quite closely to what you've been saying and kind of trajectory of the way in which water is perceived. So it's from Michelle Boyle, who says it's an uncomfortable question. We're all about uncomfortable questions here. We welcome those. Do you feel that there should be space for a conversation around the use and direct pollution of water by the beauty industry, which is mainly targeted and used by women? It is something which I've been thinking about in my daily life decisions and art practice. That's a really fascinating question, and I think equally applies to the fashion industry, which is very targeted towards women, and also has a lot of deleterious effects on water systems. So Federico, is that something that you've thought about, specifically the beauty or fashion industries?
Yeah, something that I think it's very interesting about the 21st century industry of fashion and beauty, as you mentioned, and the way it is directed to women specifically. I read a very interesting essay by Mona Chollet in the book Fatter Beauty, in which she talks about the way advertising evolved in the last 25 years and targeted women in a more empowering manner. So skincare, for example, or dressing is not anymore about being liked by men, but it's about self-care. It's about like being yourself in your skin and your clothes. So the trajectory seems to have changed in a way that it's not anymore about being liked, but it's more about liking yourself. But the dynamics, the system dynamics didn't change at all. So before, the advertising was eventually, I don't know, electrodomestic tools, because the woman was a housewife, which were polluting, which were consumeristic in the same way. While today, the objects are more specifically directed to the women and as a person, as an independent individual. But I think that, again, also this implies that the target of these is the Western woman, usually, while the people that are more suffering the effects of this way of producing and consuming of course, people in the global South. And I think that this, again, goes back to the idea that even if this is branded as something for yourself, the water line, so the connection that exists through water in this case, so from the producers to the seas or the rivers where products are transported to the consumer, this interconnectedness through water exists and is made in the wrong way. I mean, we're all part of this system. It's very complicated to avoid to have this bad role. But I think this is also a great example where we see that water is, even if we don't want to acknowledge it, is linking all of us. So the way in which we want to acknowledge this and maybe actively change or try to have a change in this process, I think that it's very important. And I don't know who did the question, but this is a great example of how the water interconnected exists and is very much present there. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating how water-related products are sold to Western women. I was speaking to an artist, Anya Paintsall, the other day, who was saying that occasionally she posts on her Instagram an open question to her followers saying, what can I do that's nice for myself? And so often people will, sort of 90% of the comments will say, oh, there's this really nice moisturizer that you should buy. And there is this idea, particularly that women constantly need to be moisturizing themselves. I also saw something about how Jennifer Aniston has very often been cast in advertisements to do either with moisturizer or drinking like bottled water, which raised the question, why is Jennifer Aniston so dry all of the time? And in fact, you know, our bodies are probably quite self-regulating in that way. But it's definitely something that has been commercially exploited. So we've got another question now from Emily Perry. Hi, Emily, who said, thanks for your interesting talk, a very messy, open question, but I wonder if you can talk more to capitalism controls nature and women. I'm thinking about women equaling animal/wild and men equaling human/civilized. How do you understand this in contemporary art and culture? Because that's a sort of age-old association, but I think in many ways still very dominant, if you would agree with that, Federico.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, first of all, I think that it's always very important, and when we think about capitalism and in particular capitalist accumulation, and we think that these models were designed in times where societies and politicians were only men. And I think that this is a very important topic today, especially when we look at, as you mentioned before, the temporary collection versus temporary exhibitions versus collections, for instance, is that in the art there is still a strong drive towards accumulation, so towards making shows in galleries that are sales driven, that collection want to expand, that permanent exhibition. So this idea that there is still strong extractive attitude in the art world, and I think that this is a bit linked to what Derrida said. So to name is to own, but also to own is to be in power. No, so and I think that this is very interesting, especially when we oppose this to these. I was reading this interesting article in which there was this idea about how collections, for instance, are always driven or only designed as archives to material form of culture and artistic production. So that means that all immaterial culture, orality, dances, or other forms of artistic and cultural practice that were more typical or are more typical from, for example, African countries, are not relevant because they cannot be owned, they cannot be archived, they cannot be sold. And that also, in that way, we see how this racial and sexual hierarchy that we were mentioning before has a great impact in the way we see art today, meaning that what is valuable in galleries is only material, what is present in museums collection is only material, and of course, having a collection means occupying space, needing space, means transportation, means like there's a lot of consequences that are not just about discrimination towards certain practices, but also about the ethical aspects of making exhibitions today. And I think this is a very interesting topic of conversation in contemporary art and in contemporary cultural scene, because we have been hard taste has been shaped by capitalist and extractivist approaches in economy, in politics, and in society. And I think that this is something that we also need to try to remember as often as possible when we the way we think we have taste or we like things is often not our own taste, but how we've been driven towards objects, towards materials.
Yeah, that's a great answer, and I think very relevant to Emily herself, who is a performance art and did a brilliant performance at the collection a couple of years ago, and made us all, I think about the way that collections acquire objects, but also the potential for acquiring non-material artworks. And in fact, the first performance entered the collection just a couple of months ago. So we've got another question here, which I think will be our last, which is from Jenny saying, are there any contemporary artists directly addressing the place of water in the process of birth? And I can partly answer that because there's a work in Women in Water by an artist called Joanna Moss, which is a painting of a very enlarged and colorized pregnancy scan. And it's the first work in the exhibition. Her practice relates to the way in which modern technology mediates our lives. So on this painting, you can see the word Siemens, a brand that is used in prenatal scans, and which is one of the ways in which technology impinges on the beginning of life. So that is an example of one artist, but are there others, Federico, that you can think of?
Yeah, I think that are very relevant for the topic, and they are also working a lot with Neymani's theory. Two Polish performers and researchers. They're called, if I'm pronouncing them wrong, Justyna Gorowska and Ewelina Jarosz. I can share maybe the names with the person who answered the question. And they presented last year a manifesto for the hydrosexual movement in art. So they actually, they're based in Poland, and they work a lot with the Baltic Sea. And they're actually, in their performances, in their writing, they directly refer to this idea of that art needs this hydrofeminist movement as an integral aspect of not only of that it should be included in the practice, but that should also motivate the practice and should shape our critical reaction to such practices. So I think that's a very pertinent example. And I've also seen a performance by them. They're really great. So yeah, I can share the link maybe with you or the person in the chat. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe if I make you a host quickly, then you can share that the name of those artists in the chat. And in the meantime,
yeah,
as a practical question, which I will answer. From Ruth Broadbent, who said, is there a way to view the exhibition online if we can't visit in person? And thanks for such an interesting talk. Thank you, Ruth, for coming to watch the talk. There isn't a way of, we have recently joined Bloomberg Connect, and we now have a profile as the Women's Art Collection on there. And so there is a page on the app which has all of the artworks and the interpretation and also some installation shots. We haven't created a virtual exhibition for this one, but hopefully that will give some sense of what it's like. And the exhibition continues in person until 25th of February. So I do encourage anyone who hasn't seen it and might be able to before then to come along. But I want to say thank you so much, Federico, for such a fascinating talk. I think I speak on behalf of everyone in saying that we have learned so much in the last hour. And thank you again, everyone, for joining. So I'll say goodbye now.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.